Hello, my name is Mr. McMillan, and welcome to part 1 of my introduction to the ontological argument for the existence of God. In part 1, I'll introduce you to the background ideas necessary to understand the argument, before progressing on to examining Anselm's classical form. In part 2, I will outline some of the other versions of the argument, before examining the main criticisms of the ontological arguments. All of the arguments for the existence of God claim to be logical attempts to demonstrate why we should accept the existence of God. The cosmological argument appeals to the existence of the universe itself, as well as the concept of causation. The teleological argument appeals to the concepts of purpose and design. Now we move on to the ontological argument, which claims that once we understand the idea of God, that we should see that God must exist in reality. It is a very different type of argument compared to those I've just mentioned. Both the cosmological and teleological arguments were examples of inductive arguments, which means they try to build a case of evidence that might persuade us of their conclusion, but they cannot provide strict proof. For example, if I were to say the sun will rise tomorrow, this is an inductive argument. It assumes that what has happened in the past will continue in the future, which means although the conclusion is highly likely, it is not 100% certain. The ontological argument, by contrast, is deductive. This means that if we accept the premises of the argument are true, then we have to accept its conclusion. Here's a simple example of a deductive argument. Premise 1, all Labradors are dogs. Premise 2, Jerry is a Labrador. Therefore, I conclude that Jerry is a dog. If premise 1 and 2 are true, my conclusion must also be true, as this is a valid deductive argument. The cosmological and teleological arguments are both a posteriori arguments. This means their truth would be established after looking at evidence from the world around us. An example of a simple a posteriori statement would be, there is life on Mars. I could only find out if this is true after looking for evidence. By contrast, the ontological argument is a priori, which means that its truth can be assessed prior to experience. In other words, it is based on understanding the definitions of things. For example, all bachelors are unmarried is an a priori statement. We know it is true without having to meet any actual bachelors. Finally, the other arguments claim that the statement God exists is a synthetic statement, which means its truth could only be established by looking for evidence. Much like the statement white bears exist could only be proven true by visiting the South Pole or a decent zoo. However, the ontological argument claims that the statement God exists is an analytic statement. An analytic statement is one where the predicate is already included in our definition of the subject. For example, the statement triangles have 3 sides is analytic. I don't have to verify it by going and finding a triangle. Analytic statements can be verified without the need for external evidence. What makes the ontological argument so bold and so different is that it claims that once we understand what we mean by the idea of God, we can be certain that God actually exists. The most famous form of the ontological argument was formulated by former Archbishop of Canterbury and wearer of very large hats, St. Anselm. Anselm said he wrote as someone with faith seeking understanding, which is why his work is written as a prayer rather than a philosophical thesis. Anselm in fact wrote 2 forms of the ontological argument, which in some ways could be considered as 2 sides of the same coin. Anselm's medieval style of writing can be quite intimidating, so I'm going to summarise his argument, although I do recommend you try to read the original yourself. Anselm's argument effectively forms what mathematicians call a proof by contradiction. He makes an assumption but shows that this leads to a logical contradiction and therefore the assumption must be false. His argument is based on accepting 3 premises. Number 1. God is something than which nothing greater can be thought of. Premise 2. Things can exist either in the mind only or in the mind and reality. Premise 3. It is greater for a thing to exist in the mind and reality rather than just in the mind only. At this point in time, we don't know whether God exists in the mind only or in the mind and reality. So Anselm asks us to make the assumption that God exists in the mind only. So let's call our assumption A1. But if we add our assumption A1, God exists in the mind only, to premise 3, which says it is greater to exist in the mind and reality than the mind only, then it is possible for us to imagine a being who exists in the mind and reality, and this being would therefore be greater than the God who exists in the mind only. This would mean that the God we started off with is now not something than which nothing greater can be thought of, since we can think of something greater, i.e. some kind of supergod who actually exists. Therefore, God is now both something than which nothing greater can be thought of, and at the same time not something than which nothing greater can be thought of. This is a logical contradiction. Therefore, our assumption A1 that God exists in the mind only must be false, which means according to premise 2 that the only alternative is that God must exist in the mind and reality, which means God exists. Thus we have a proof by contradiction. Anselm wrote a second form of the ontological argument, which uses almost the exact same logic as the first form. All we have to do is adjust premise 2 and 3 and then follow the logic through. This time, premise 2 says God can either exist contingently, which means he is dependent on something else, or necessarily, not dependent on anything else. And premise 3 says it is greater to exist necessarily than contingently. If this time we make our assumption that God exists contingently, then when we follow the logic through, we arrive again at a proof by contradiction. i.e., if God exists contingently, but it is greater to exist necessarily, then it would be possible to think of a being greater than God, and therefore we have the same logical contradiction as before. So we come to the conclusion that God must exist not contingently, but necessarily. That's the end of part 1. For part 2, please follow the link below. If you found this useful, please feel free to follow me on Twitter, YouTube or Facebook. You can also find an audio-only version of this video on podbean.com.